I can almost guarantee that the people paying $125 are probably three things are true about them. Number one, I can almost guarantee that they're your oldest clients. Number two, 20 years ago, 10 years ago, when you started your company, you needed to find clients no matter how, and the pricing that you chose for them was probably pretty low. What are all the ways that the current process, the current lack of a solution hurts them, causing them financial and emotional and operational stress and disorder and pain? And magnify that through this process of sales. The danger, the pitfall that you need to avoid. It's called scope creep.
Maui Mastermind presents the Business Coach Podcast, answering your questions and providing real actionable insights for building a better, stronger, more profitable business without sacrificing your time, life, or freedom anymore.
Well, welcome to this week's episode of The Business Coach. I'm your host, David Finkel, and in this week's episode, I want to talk about how can you protect your gross profit margin, but we're going to do this as a coaching session. So recently, one of our coaching clients who runs a successful services business that he's been scaling with us, he reached out to me and he shared a challenge that he's had, shared his financials, and I looked at it, and we were looking at his gross profit margin. Now, you know that the gross profit margin is the number that says, here's what our revenue is, here's what it costs us to produce our product or service, cost of goods sold, and what's left there is your gross profit. It's your profit before you pay all your other expenses. I'm your host, David Finkel, and in this week's episode, I want to talk about how can you protect your gross profit margin, but we're going to do this as a coaching session. So recently, one of our coaching clients who runs a successful services business that he's been scaling with us, he reached out to me and he shared a challenge that he's had, shared his financials, and I looked at it, and we were looking at his gross profit margin. Now, you know that here this week to how you can protect your gross profit margin. So imagine you run a services business. Now, when I looked at Richard's financials, he was operating at roughly a 40-45% gross profit margin. For a services business like his, that was way too low. And I shared the first point of coaching I shared is, I said, Richard, in your type of business, you really should be targeting a minimum floor of a 60% gross profit margin. And really your standard should be shooting for 70%. So somewhere between 60 and 70% as a gross profit margin would be where you need to be. For you to do that, I can almost guarantee that pricing is probably the biggest immediate leverage point for you to improve your gross profit margin. We went back and forth on this, and Richard had shared with me that depending which of his service team was there doing the work, he was between $125 per hour to $250 per hour in terms of billable rate. And as we talked that through, what we discovered, which is very normal, I said, Richard, I can almost guarantee that the people paying $125 are probably three things are true about them. Number one, I can almost guarantee that they're your oldest clients. Number two, I can almost guarantee that they're most demanding or difficult clients to work with. And I can almost guarantee that they're the ones who pay slowest. Now, we never got deeply into the slow pay and the collection part of it, but we did talk about the other two, trading back and forth messages. And he shared with me, David, you're right. They tend to be my oldest 2 or 3 or 4 clients, and they tend to be the most demanding and emotionally draining to work with. It makes sense. 20 years ago, 10 years ago, when you started your company, you needed to find clients no matter how, and the pricing that you chose for them was probably pretty low, right? Because you wanted to woo them away, you didn't have a track record, you were scared, plus you probably had a lower overhead simply because you were doing things on a shoestring 10, 20 years ago. Very common. And these people got spoiled because you really worked hard to please them for a very low amount of money relative. And so I went back to Richard. I said, now that we know those are true, here's my best coaching for you. First suggestion, number one, all new clients coming in should be coming in at the $250 to $300 level. Notice I just pushed them up a little bit. Generally speaking, for most services, if someone's going to pay $250 an hour, they're going to pay $295 an hour. That's not much difference. It's a sales component, which we'll get to in a moment. And I said, I want you to go back and have a real heart-to-heart with these clients and let them know and have the conversation. Hey, would say, Paul, I know we've been working with you now for the last decade, and we've never raised pricing on you before, and that's shame on me. That's been my mistake with that. Paul, you're not even aware of this, of how good you've had it. but our current new clients that come in typically will come in at a low of $250 per hour of service technician to $300 per hour. You're at still the 125. You're the lowest paying client that we have with that part. And Paul, I want to acknowledge and appreciate the relationship that we've had, but the status quo can't go on that way. We're effectively losing money by working with you, and our other clients are subsidizing the servicing that you're getting. So we've got a couple of choices here. Choice number one is we can gracefully part ways. I'm hoping we don't have to do that because I've enjoyed working with you, but that is a viable choice. And choice number two is we bring you up to reasonable rates. Now, as a way of acknowledging the fact that it really is on me that I hadn't raised rates along the way. That's been on me here, Paul. But I have to be fair about that. I'm not going to raise you all the way to $300 per hour for what we're doing with that part. But we are going to have to raise you to $225 per hour. You're still less than every new client coming in, but at least it puts you back in alignment with what we can do and still have a reasonable minimal level of profit. So that's the conversation that Richard needed to have with his clients. Now, if he's got 4 of them, 1 or 2 are probably going to say goodbye. 2 or 3 are going to stay with him. Of the 1 or 2 that leave, what I told Richard is, I bet that at least one of them are going to come back to you later on because the grass is not greener out there. If your pricing at $250 to $300 is in line with what the market is, 2 or 3 are going to stay with him. Of the 1 or 2 that leave, what I told Richard is, I bet that at least one of them are going to come back to you later on because the grass is not greener out there. If your pricing at $250 to $300 is in line with what the market is, not completely off in left field. If everyone else is charging $50 an hour and you're at $300, you better be really good on your delivery to have that extra. You can also, if Paul decides to part ways with you, you can also say, Paul, I totally respect that. I understand that. If ever we can be of service to you, please let me know. And when you come back in, if it's somewhere in the next 12 months or so, it won't be at the $300 per hour, which is where typical new clients come in. It'll be at the $250, which is at the lower end of where new clients are coming back. Wait a second, you just said it was $225. Yes, Paul, if you want to continue the relationship where we go from here forward and stay with us, I will actually give you that discount to honor the relationship. But if you're going to leave us, if later you decide to come back, it will be at the low end of what we're charging for new clients. Would you like to stay with us, Paul? Right? I can use that as a fear of what he loses out on. All right, going back to the coaching here, that's the first way that Richard can protect his gross profit margin, raising pricing, especially on his lowest performing clients. The good news is if he loses some of them, they were probably break even or losing margin clients anyways. So he targets the better number, targets to get to 70%, but certainly at least 60% on his gross profit in his business and his industry. As his coach, I can tell him that. Next is we want to look at how could he maybe change billing on some of his projects from an hourly basis. The good news about billing on service projects hourly is that if you thought it was going to take 15 or 20 hours and it ends up taking 25 or 30 hours, if I bill that fixed fee, I end up losing on that one because it took more time. So for things that are fuzzy about how long will it take, the hourly is a way to protect yourself from that. But when I do it that way, it really puts the emphasis on a cost number that I don't like it to be. I would rather charge based on value. And Richard and I had a conversation back and forth through messages about how could he, me coaching him through, how could he sell on value. For example, he might be, maybe it's a $50,000 project relative to the fact that it's going to create $1 million worth of value for them over the next 24 to 36 months, right? How can I sell value versus just dollars? I told him my next coaching part is if you're going to do that, the most important element for him to focus in on, since he's the main person doing selling for his company, I said to Richard, I want you to go back to the materials that we have about building motivation, magnifying pain in the sales process. And Richard's comment was, I never thought about that, but you're right. I go in there as an expert. I give them a solution. They come to us. But I recognize if I'm going to be doing value pricing, I've got to get good at how I sell, which means the most important leverage point in selling by far is the motivation step. What's the current problem that they have? What's it costing them? What are all the ways that the current process, the current lack of a solution hurts them, causing them financial and emotional and operational stress and disorder and pain, and magnify that through this process of sales. And I pointed Richard to the materials to go through to do that. And he can get better at selling. By the way, being good enough to take 10 or 15 extra minutes in the sales process before you present your solution to really magnify and identify the cost and pain of their current situation and put a price to the status quo if they don't fix this situation, makes your selling much easier. It makes your ability to sell go from selling at X price point to 2X or 50% more of X or some number greater. I've seen that with clients, and we've been coaching clients on that for decades. So that was the next place that he could use Richard to protect his gross profit margin, was to be smart about how the model he used to price and the leverage point to be able to sell effectively at that price point. The next and fourth and final place I want to talk about here is what he needed to do to protect himself. So if I am going to sell on a fixed menu, in other words, I'm not going to sell hourly, but now this project's going to be $28,000. That's the cost for you, Paul. If I successfully sell, I should be able to get the margin that I've targeted. Here's the danger, the pitfall that you need to avoid. It's called scope creep. And you probably, if you've been following this podcast, The Business Coach, now for a long time, you've heard me bring this up on other conversations as part of this podcast series. But I want to come back to it fresh. So if Richard's selling his services on a fixed price, a value price, $28,000 for example, he needs to preemptively protect his company from scope creep. The most common way for scope creep is you agree to give them $28,000 for a defined scope of work. The single biggest failure most people make is they don't define the scope. The second way you protect yourself is you think, if I'm selling them X, what's the most common Y and Z that the people who buy X from us later go on to want or expect, and many of them want or expect us to add it in at no cost. It happens all the time. So the first place I go is I talk to Paul, saying, Paul, here's specifically the scope that we're going to produce for you for this $28,000. In writing, here's what it is, X, and I lay it all out, X1, X2, X3, X4. I lay it all out. You have any questions about that, Paul? Wonderful. Now, Paul, on many occasions, when people get X from us, they later discover they also want Y and Z as well. And I know for you that budget is a constraint. So right now you don't currently want Y and Z. But if later you want Y and Z, I just want to let you know what the cost would be for you so that you can be prepared for that. If you later want to add it, you control that if you want to add it or not. The cost for Y is $15,000. The cost for Z is $12,000, just for you to know, so that if later you want to add one or the other, that you know what it would be. Now, over time, those pricings are going to change based on market realities, but that's currently what it would cost for you for Y or for Z. Make sense? Great. And now Paul later on, 3 months later, says, I loved X, but why haven't you done Z yet? Well, Paul, we've defined X. This is what we're going to do. Remember at the beginning we talked about, I even sent you that follow-up email, we absolutely can do Z for you. And what we said 3 months ago was that was going to be $12,000 or whatever the then price down the road would be. Now, actually, that's currently priced at $13,000. Is it important for you to have Z? And now I can give him perhaps a price break or not. But the point being is, Paul might now decide not to get Z, but he's not going to expect you to throw it in for free. That's us preempting scope creep. And here's the coaching for it. It was very specific. Number one, we define the scope in writing and we have conversation about that. Number two, we ask the question, when people buy X from us, what's the most common Y and Z, one or two other things that later on they either want or expect to be part of it, and they want us to add it in. And so we clearly make those separate and let them know, hey, first of all, I try to upsell them. Hey, you're likely going to want Y and Z. Why don't we add this in right now? Oh, you can't do that? You don't want to do it? No problem. If you later want it, Y is going to cost this much, Z is going to cost this much. I follow that up in writing as well. I preempted him now. Paul does not think he's going to get Y or Z thrown in for free. Ideally, I sell him X, Y, and Z all at once. Why wouldn't I? Let's upsell from that part. Let's give him the full value of what product or service, or in Richard's case, service, that you can offer. At the very least, though, I want to defend that I'm not going to give Y and Z for free, that it was clearly agreed to up front so that I protected or preempted that objection coming up later on. Otherwise, what's going to happen, you see it all the time, especially in service businesses. Your field team is out there, you produce X just like you promised, and while you're there, the customer comes out and says, well, hang on a second, this isn't enough. You're supposed to do Y as well. And the person who's the supervisor on site gets frazzled. They want to keep the customer happy. The customer's complaining. They're loud, they're abrasive, and they start doing some or all of Y, and your gross profit margin just eroded to the point in some cases where some service businesses are now losing money on the job. And now you have specific concrete coaching to protect yourself from that occurrence. So thank you for listening to this episode of The Business Coach. And my goal here today was to almost be like we were doing a coaching session, you and I, where Richard was the one who prompted the question, but I was looking at it as if I was coaching you and your company. All right, I wish you every success applying what you've been learning from The Business Coach. As always, if we can be of service to you, please reach out to our company, MauiMastermind.com. You can find out how we might be able to help you go faster in your own business itself by one-to-one and small group coaching. Thank you for participating today. I look forward to seeing you next week. Bye-bye, everybody.